July 31, 1945, 6:12 in the morning. Fog rolls low across Newark Bay, thick enough to swallow the cranes lining the docks. The air smells of diesel exhaust and salt water, and somewhere beneath the mist, a ship's horn groans twice, long and low, like the harbor itself is exhaling. Dockworkers in oil-stained coveralls stand at the rail, coffee cooling in their hands, watching a shape emerge from the gray, the deck of the escort carrier HMS Reaper, low and gray, rocking gently against the swell. Chains rattle, winches groan. And lashed to that deck, wings folded strangely close to the fuselage, sit machines that most of these men have never seen up close, sleek. Shark-nosed aircraft with engines slung beneath swept wings like blades waiting to be drawn. These are Messerschmitt Me-262s, Hitler's jets, the first operational jet fighters in the history of aerial warfare, and until a few months earlier, they belonged to the Luftwaffe. Nobody on that dock knows it yet, but what happens next, the tests, the flights, the arguments in wind tunnels and hangars across Ohio, will quietly rewrite the future of American aviation. To understand why this moment matters, you have to go back further. Back to 1938, when a young design team at Messerschmitt in Augsburg, Germany, began sketching an aircraft unlike anything flying at the time, one without a propeller at all. Germany had been racing ahead in a technology almost no one else took seriously, the turbojet engine. While Allied engineers still obsessed over piston horsepower and propeller pitch, German engineers Anselm France and his team at Junkers were coaxing raw, violent thrust out of spinning turbine blades, the Jumo 4 engine, a temperamental beast that could push an aircraft through the sky faster than any propeller-driven fighter alive. By 1943, the airframe was ready. Test pilots climbing into the Me-262 described something almost impossible to put into words. No, not the growl of a piston engine, a shriek, a tearing hiss of compressed air and fire, and then acceleration that pinned you back into the seat like a fist to the chest. Pilots who'd flown Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s, their whole careers came out of the cockpit pale, hands shaking, muttering that nothing on earth flew like this. But here's where the story takes its first cruel turn. Adolf Hitler, obsessed with retaliation after Allied bombing raids on German cities, personally intervened. He didn't want a fighter. He wanted a bomber, a Blitz bomber to strike back at London and beyond. Engineers pleaded. Willy Messerschmitt himself argued the airframe wasn't built for it. Hitler didn't care. Precious months Germany didn't have, were burned trying to convert a fighter into something it was never meant to be. By the time sanity prevailed and the Me-262 was finally released to fighter units in late 1944, it was already too late to change the war's outcome. Fuel was scarce. Trained pilots were scarcer. And the skies over Germany were thick with Allied bombers and their fighter escorts, hunting for exactly these kinds of targets. Still, when the Me-262 did appear, it terrified Allied airmen. Bomber crews would be droning along in tight formation, gunners scanning the horizon out of habit more than expectation. When a shape would streak past below them at a closing speed, no one had a name for yet. There, then gone, no warning growl of engines building, no time to track it in the gun sight. Just a flash of gray metal and twin exhaust trails, and by the time anyone reacted, the jet was already a mile away, climbing. American and British pilots who tangled with the 262 in the air, pilots flying P-51 Mustangs, among the finest propeller fighters ever built, came back to their bases badly shaken. Some described trying to turn inside the jet and simply watching it vanish from view, outrunning them as if they were standing still. A few got lucky, catching the 262s during takeoff or landing, the one vulnerable window when the jet engines were slow to respond to throttle changes. But head-to-head, in open sky, nothing the Allies had could touch it, which raised an uncomfortable question inside Allied intelligence circles, one that grew more urgent as 1945 wore on. What happens if Germany manages to mass-produce this thing before the war ends? That fear is exactly why, as Allied forces pushed into the collapsing remains of the Third Reich in the spring of 1945, one man was handed an unusual, almost surreal assignment. His name was Colonel Harold E. Watson, and his job wasn't to fight. It was to hunt, not for soldiers, for aircraft. Specifically, for every flyable Me-262 he could find, sitting abandoned on captured airfields, in forests, on autobahns pressed into service as makeshift runways. The operation would later earn a nickname that stuck in aviation history books, Watson's Wizards. And what Watson and his hand-picked team of pilots and engineers were about to attempt, flying captured enemy jets, aircraft none of them had trained on, off foreign airstrips and across an ocean, would be one of the strangest and most dangerous salvage missions of the entire war. Because now those jets were on American soil. And in a handful of hangars in Ohio, engineers were about to open them up, wire them with instruments, and find out exactly what Hitler's jet could really do. What they discovered inside would leave some of them speechless. Meanwhile, back at Wright Field, Ohio, autumn of 1945, the air inside Hangar 18 carries a different kind of tension. Fluorescent lights hum overhead. The concrete floor is cold under boots, stained dark in places from decades of oil and hydraulic fluid. And parked in the center of it all sits a Messerschmitt Me-262, its skin still marked with faded Luftwaffe crosses, swastikas painted over now with white American stars, though if you look closely, the ghost of the old markings still bleeds through the fresh paint. Engineers from Wright Field's Air Technical Intelligence Unit circle the aircraft slowly, clipboards in hand, flashlights probing into the gaps around the engine nacelles. Some of these men have spent years designing piston engines, Allison V12s, Pratt & Whitney radials, machines they understand in their bones. Now they're crouched beneath a wing, staring into the intake of a Junkers Jumo 4 turbojet, and for a long moment, nobody says anything. Because what they're looking at doesn't behave like anything they've built. The Jumo 4 was a marvel born out of desperation. Germany, by 1944, faced a severe shortage of the high-temperature alloys needed for turbine blades, nickel, chromium, cobalt. The exotic metals that let jet engines survive the brutal heat of combustion without melting. American and British engines developed later in the jet age would lean heavily on these alloys. German engineers didn't have that luxury. So they improvised, using simpler steel alloys and hollow, air-cooled turbine blades to survive temperatures the metal was never designed to withstand. It shouldn't have worked reliably. And in practice, it didn't, not for long. Luftwaffe pilots knew the 4 engines had a service life measured in mere hours, sometimes as few as 10 to 25 hours of flight time before a blade could fail catastrophically. That single flaw did more to ground the German jet fleet than Allied bombs ever did. But here's the part that stopped the American engineers cold. For those precious hours it ran, the thing worked. Each of the twin Jumo 4 engines produced around 1,980 pounds of thrust, enough combined force to push the Me-262 to speeds approaching 540 miles per hour in level flight. Compare that to the top speed of a P-51 Mustang, one of America's finest fighters, topping out around 440 miles per hour flat out. The gap wasn't small. It was a leap into an entirely different era of flight, and every engineer standing in that hangar understood exactly what it meant. Curiosity turned to something closer to alarm when they moved to the cockpit. The Me-262 carried four 30mm Mk-108 cannons crammed into its nose, weapons so powerful that a single hit from just a couple of shells could tear a heavy bomber out of the sky. Slower firing than typical Allied machine guns, yes, but devastating at the ranges these jets could close in seconds. American gun crews at Aberdeen Proving Ground, testing captured Mk-108 ammunition, noted the sheer destructive potential packed into each shell, explosive rounds designed to punch through aluminum skin and detonate deep inside a bomber's fuselage. Then came the swept wings. At first glance, engineers assumed the wing's slight backward angle, about 18.5 degrees, was purely for aesthetic or structural reasons. But wind tunnel analysis back at facilities like NACA's Langley Laboratory told a different story. That sweep helped delay compressibility effects at high speed, buying stability in a speed range where straight-winged aircraft began to shudder and lose control. German engineers, it turned out, understood something about high-speed aerodynamics that Allied designers were only beginning to theorize. It's worth pausing here to ask, how far ahead was Germany, really? Some of what American engineers found inside these captured jets wouldn't just influence future fighters. It would ripple forward into commercial aviation, into the shape of jetliners still flying passengers today. Swept wings, potted engines beneath the wings rather than buried in the fuselage. These weren't small design quirks. They were glimpses of the next 50 years of flight. Back on the tarmac, the true test still waited, putting the aircraft into the air. Colonel Watson's pilots, the men who'd flown the 262s out of collapsing Germany months earlier, briefed American test pilots on what to expect, and the warnings were serious. Unlike a propeller engine, jet throttles responded slowly. Spool-up time from idle to full power could take agonizing seconds, an eternity if you needed sudden power during landing. Get it wrong and the engine could flame out entirely, or worse, catch fire. That risk wasn't theoretical. During testing and ferrying operations, at least one captured Me-262 was lost to an engine failure in flight, forcing its pilot to bail out. Every test flight carried genuine danger, flying an aircraft type that had killed experienced Luftwaffe pilots too. Men lost not to Allied guns, but to the jet's own mechanical temperament, its narrow margins for error. And yet, pilot after pilot who took the 262 into the air came back changed. Test pilots described the silence, almost eerie compared to a roaring piston engine, then a smooth, building surge of acceleration unlike anything in their logbooks. Colonel Watson himself would later describe flying it as an entirely different sensation from any propeller aircraft he had piloted. The engineers had their data now, the performance numbers, the thrust curves, the wing sweep angles copied into notebooks that would circulate through American aircraft manufacturers within months. Bell, North American, Lockheed, all suddenly hungry for anything related to German jet research. But somewhere in all those numbers sat a darker question, one that would follow this aircraft into the history books. If Hitler hadn't delayed its deployment, if fuel supplies hadn't collapsed, if more pilots had lived long enough to master it, just how differently might those last years of the war in the air have gone? That question hung over Wright Field long after the test flights ended, and it followed the aircraft's story to its final, quiet chapter, one that unfolded not in the skies over Germany, but on a stretch of California coastline, and later, in the design rooms of American aircraft manufacturers who couldn't stop thinking about what they'd seen. Some of the captured Me-262s were shipped further west, to Muroc Army Air Field, the same stretch of dry lakebed that would later become Edwards Air Force Base. Ground Zero, for America's post-war assault on the sound barrier. Here, under the punishing desert sun, with heat shimmering off the hardpan and dust devils spinning across the horizon, American test pilots pushed the jets harder still, probing the edges of what this German technology could do. Every flight was a negotiation with risk, engines with only hours of guaranteed life left in them, fuel systems never designed for the punishment of repeated test cycles. And underneath it all, the knowledge that at least one pilot and one aircraft had already been lost trying to answer these same questions. Then, in August of 1946, disaster struck again. During a public demonstration at the National Air Races in Cleveland, Ohio, a captured Me-262 crashed, killing its pilot in front of a stunned crowd. It was a brutal reminder that this aircraft, for all its brilliance, had never stopped being dangerous. The Jumo engines that had terrified Allied bomber crews over Germany could still kill the men flying them in peacetime, thousands of miles from the war that built them. And yet the knowledge gained from these flights didn't die with the aircraft. It moved quietly, methodically, into the bloodstream of American aviation. Engineers at Bell Aircraft studied captured German wind tunnel data alongside their own X-1 program. The aircraft that would eventually break the sound barrier in 1947, with Chuck Yeager at the controls. North American Aviation's designers, working on what would become the F-86 Sabre, redesigned their fighter mid-development after reviewing swept-wing research recovered from German laboratories, abandoning a straight-wing design for the swept configuration that gave the Sabre its edge over Soviet MiGs in the skies over Korea just a few years later. Even commercial aviation felt the aftershock. The podded engine layout, jet engines slung in nacelles beneath the wing rather than buried inside the fuselage, became the standard configuration adopted by Boeing for its jet airliners. A design choice that traced its intellectual lineage back to German wartime engineering, refined and perfected on American soil. It's a strange, uncomfortable thread to pull on, isn't it? That some of the innovations carrying millions of passengers safely across oceans today share a bloodline with a weapon built under a dictator's direct orders, flown by pilots fighting for a regime responsible for unspeakable atrocities. Technology doesn't carry moral weight on its own. It's neutral, indifferent to the hands that shape it. But history rarely lets us forget where an idea was born, even when that idea eventually serves purposes its original creators never intended. Back in Germany, in the war's final chaotic weeks, most of the Me-262 story had already been decided by forces far bigger than any single aircraft. Fuel shortages grounded jets that could have flown. Bombing raids destroyed factories before they could reach full production. Skilled pilots, the ones who might have mastered this unforgiving machine, were dying faster than replacements could be trained. By the time production numbers climbed into the hundreds, the war machine surrounding the aircraft was already collapsing under its own weight. Roughly 1,400 Me-262s were built in total, yet historians estimate only a few hundred ever saw actual combat, hampered by fuel, by pilot shortages, by an air war already slipping irreversibly from Germany's grasp. Which brings the story back to that foggy dock at Newark Bay, and to Hangar 18 at Wright Field, and to the desert heat of Muroc, three quiet corners of history where American engineers sat with captured proof of just how close the balance of air power had come to tipping. Not because Germany won the war in the air, it didn't, but because for a narrow window of time, German engineers had reached a technological plateau the rest of the world hadn't even begun climbing yet. The lesson those Wright Field engineers carried forward wasn't really about jets, or thrust figures, or wing sweep angles. It was about how quickly the future can arrive, and how easily it can be squandered by poor decisions at the top, even when the engineering underneath is sound. Hitler's insistence on turning a fighter into a bomber cost Germany the only aircraft that might have changed its fortunes in the air war. Meanwhile, an ocean away, a small team of American colonels, engineers, and test pilots studied what remained, learned what they could, and folded those lessons into machine that would define the next 50 years of flight. Somewhere in an aviation museum today, the Smithsonian's Udvar-Hazy Center among them, a restored Me-262 sits under quiet lighting, its jet intake silent now. Its story mostly known only to those willing to stop and read the placard beside it. But every time a modern airliner lifts off a runway, engines slung beneath swept wings, carrying families toward vacations or reunions or new beginnings, there's a distant echo of Hangar 18 in that motion. An echo of engineers standing beneath a wing in 1945, staring into an intake, quietly realizing the future had already arrived, built by the wrong side, salvaged by the right one, and carried forward into every flight since. If this story of ingenuity born from the darkest chapter of the 20th century made you think differently about how history and innovation collide, let us know in the comments what part surprised you most, and consider subscribing for more stories where the smallest engineering decisions change the course of history.